My name's Ethan Brennan. The day my wife left, a stranger called, offering me gold, secrets, and revenge. The cardboard boxes looked like tombstones lined against the wall of my new apartment. Each one had a handwritten label that made me feel smaller. Kitchen, books, clothes, failed marriage. I sat on the floor with my back against the radiator, holding a cold cup of coffee that had gone bitter hours ago. The place smelled like fresh paint and disappointment. Vera had taken everything that mattered. The house in Evanston, the Subaru, even our golden retriever, Mozart. The divorce papers still sat on the counter, signed and sealed like the end credits of a movie I never wanted to watch. I told myself I was fine, that this was freedom. But the silence had teeth. My phone buzzed. I didn't need to look to know who it was. I did anyway. Hope you're enjoying your sad little apartment. Richard just moved his new Steinway into your old music room. Costs more than you'll make in 5 years. I stared at the message until the words blurred. Then another came through. They're turning your practice studio into a cigar lounge. For someone who actually matters. My jaw locked. My thumb hovered over the delete button. But then a picture came through. Richard Ashcroft. Tall. Grinning. Standing in what used to be my home office. The Harvard diploma on the wall. My grandfather's war medals gone. He looked like a man inspecting his prize. My chest felt tight. Vera knew exactly what she was doing. You'll die broke and alone. Just like your grandfather. At least he had secrets to keep him company. What do you have? Ethan, a violin and delusions. I wanted to throw the phone across the room. My arm was halfway through the motion when it rang again. Not a text this time. An actual call. The screen showed a string of zeros followed by a single one. I froze. 3 rings. 4. 5. On the 6th, I answered. This is Ethan Brennan. Mr. Brennan. The voice was male. Crisp. Like someone used to being obeyed. Colonel James Whitman. U.S. Treasury. Gold Recovery Division. I need you to listen carefully. For a second, I thought it was some kind of scam. Maybe a prank. Who is this I told you? Treasury Department. Your grandfather, Eugene Brennan, served in Operation Nightfall in 1965. That operation was classified for 60 years. As of midnight last night, it's been declassified. My pulse kicked. My grandfather was a supply sergeant in Vietnam. He played piano at the officers' club. That was his cover. Mr. Brennan. He was actually a cryptographic specialist working for military intelligence. He secured something during that operation, something that now holds significant value. I swallowed. What kind of value are we talking about? Colonel Whitman hesitated. Gold. Mr. Brennan. Government-issued bullion. 72 crates of it. Each stamped with your grandfather's initials. I laughed. Short and sharp. You've got the wrong guy. My grandfather died in a state-run nursing home. If he had 72 crates of gold, I think we'd have noticed. He chose not to claim it, said the colonel, to protect his country and his family, but he left instructions. The claim can only be activated by his direct descendant. Under certain conditions. What conditions? A pause. You were to be contacted on the day you lost everything. Those were his exact words. When my grandson has nothing left to lose, give him everything I couldn't claim. The room tilted. I stared at the phone like it might explode. He's been dead 35 years. How could he possibly know what day, Mr. Brennan? Your grandfather was very good at predicting patterns. It's why he was valuable to intelligence. There's a first-class ticket in your name. Chicago to Washington. Departing in 3 hours. Seat 2 amperes. His file specifically requested that seat. I pressed the heel of my hand against my forehead. This sounds insane. I understand, said Whitman. But I assure you, the gold is real. So is the documentation. If you want to decline, the department will absorb it into the Federal Reserve. I looked around the apartment. Bare walls. A single chair. My violin case leaning in the corner. The radiator hissed like it was laughing. And if I come to Washington, then we finish what your grandfather started. But you only have 72 hours before the claim transfers to the government. The line went dead. For a long time I sat there, Listening to the hum of the city outside, Lake Michigan shimmered through the window, gray and restless. Like the old man's eyes in the black and white photo that used to hang in our living room, Vera's messages still glowed on the screen. The piano, the cigar lounge, Richard's smug grin. I picked up my violin case. The leather was worn smooth from years of travel. Inside, under the instrument, was a small notebook my mother had given me the day of the divorce. My grandfather's old music journal. She'd said, "Keep it safe." I flipped it open. The first page carried a single sentence, written in faint pencil. For Ethan, when silence becomes gold. The radiator clicked, and the city outside went quiet, as if holding its breath. I closed the notebook, grabbed my coat, and started packing. The flight to Washington left before sunrise. The city outside O'Hare looked half asleep. Lights bleeding through the fog. Trucks humming on wet asphalt. I didn't bother to check a bag. Everything I owned could fit in the overhead bin, including my violin and the notebook that suddenly felt heavier than gold itself. When the plane lifted, I stared out the window at the black water of Lake Michigan sliding away. I told myself this was insane. A dead man's message. A government colonel. 72 crates of gold. It sounded like something out of a bad spy movie. But every time I tried to convince myself it was nonsense, I remembered the handwriting on that first page. My grandfather's voice used to tremble the same way he wrote, soft and deliberate, like he was keeping time only he could hear. 3 hours later, Washington spread out beneath the wings, all white stone and sharp sunlight. At baggage claim, a man in uniform held a sign with my name. He didn't smile. I followed him out to a black SUV with tinted windows. The ride through the city was silent except for the hum of tires. I caught a glimpse of the Treasury building rising behind iron gates, its marble columns bright against the winter sky. Colonel Whitman was waiting in the lobby. He was younger than I expected, maybe mid-50s. Square shoulders, haircut too perfect to be accidental. His handshake was firm but short. "Mr. Brennan," he said. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. Follow me. Please." We passed through a maze of security checkpoints. My shoes and belt went into bins twice. At the final door, a guard scanned my face and compared it to a photo on a tablet. Then the lock clicked, and Whitman led me down a hallway lined with frosted glass. The room at the end looked like a museum exhibit: one metal table, 2 chairs, and a stack of file boxes sealed with red tape. Whitman gestured for me to sit. "Your grandfather's service record," he said. "The real one. Everything you've been told was a cover story." He peeled back the tape on the first box and slid out a manila folder. Inside was a black and white photo of a young soldier sitting at a piano in the jungle. The caption read, "Operation Nightfall. Laos. Etienne Jobai Loshawu." The face was my grandfather's. The same calm eyes that used to watch me practice scales as a kid. "He wasn't just a musician," said Whitman. "He was part of a classified intelligence team sent to retrieve stolen gold reserves being moved through Southeast Asia. Officially, that gold never existed." I felt my mouth go dry. So the story about the officers' club was a lie. A partial truth. Whitman said. "He played to gather information. He also encoded it. Your grandfather was what we called a harmonic cryptographer. He created ciphers using musical notation. Every composition he wrote could hide coordinates, numbers, even entire messages." He pulled another photo from the file. A jungle airstrip. A crashed transport plane. Men standing beside. Crates marked U.S. property. One of them, my grandfather, held a ledger against his chest. That plane carried gold bars earmarked for covert exchanges. Whitman said, "Your grandfather recorded everything and was supposed to hand it over. But the crates vanished before he returned. He filed a sealed report accusing Ashcroft Logistics, a defense contractor, of attempting to smuggle the gold. 2 days later, he was reassigned and the report buried. Ashcroft. The name hit like a blow. Richard's family. I told Whitman about the texts, the photos, the connection. He didn't seem surprised. The Ashcroft family has deep roots in defense procurement. It wouldn't be the first time their name came up in our archives. He handed me a small envelope. The paper was yellowed. The ink faint but legible. My name written in pencil. I opened it carefully. Inside was a folded page, brittle at the edges. Ethan, if you are reading this, you have lost everything but time. The music I left for you will tell you what I could not. Trust no one who profits from war. Find the place where silence hums the loudest. You'll know it when you hear it. I looked up. What does that even mean? Whitman shrugged. Your grandfather left that letter with his file 40 years ago. He also specified the conditions under which we were to contact you. He predicted, quite accurately, that you would need to lose what he called your illusions before you could understand his truth. I leaned back, trying to take it in. Gold. Cryptography. A buried scandal. All tied to a man who taught me to tune by ear and never rush the tempo. What happens now, I asked. We verify the claim. You're his sole surviving descendant. You'll need to locate the encoded coordinates that identify the storage site. Once verified, the Treasury will recover the assets. And if I walk away, then the gold becomes government property. But given your grandfather's note, I think you'll find that difficult. He stood and gathered the files. I noticed a faint scar cutting through his right eyebrow. Old but clean. Military precision extended even to his wounds. There's a car waiting outside. You'll be taken to a secure apartment tonight. Tomorrow you meet with our legal counsel. Bring anything your grandfather left you, especially his music. On the way out, I passed a wall of framed photos. Rows of men and women who looked too serious to be ordinary bureaucrats. My reflection caught between them. A middle-aged musician in a wrinkled jacket and worn shoes. I didn't belong here. Outside, the air bit cold. The driver opened the SUV door. But I hesitated, staring up at the building. My grandfather had worked under that seal once. The same eagle holding arrows and an olive branch. Somewhere in its shadow, he had hidden 72 crates of gold. Back in the car, the driver handed me a secure folder. Inside were travel receipts, a Treasury ID badge, and a single-page memo. At the bottom, one handwritten line stood out. It was in pencil. The same shaky hand as the letter. When silence becomes gold, play the truth. I closed my eyes and heard faint notes from memory. A melody my grandfather used to hum while fixing the old radio in our kitchen. It was the same tune I'd found in his journal. The same rhythm that had haunted me since last night. The driver asked if I was all right. I told him yes. But my voice didn't sound like mine. When we reached the apartment, I didn't unpack. I set my violin case on the table, opened the notebook, and began tracing the notes across the first page. Each line, each pause, each measure felt deliberate. The pattern wasn't random. He had hidden something in plain sight. Waiting for me to listen closely enough, the city outside hummed like an orchestra warming up. I picked up the violin and played the opening phrase. The melody was slow, aching, and underneath it, I heard something I had never noticed before. A pulse like coordinates buried in rhythm. Somewhere. Across decades and secrets. My grandfather was still speaking. I didn't sleep that night. The melody looped in my head, steady and exact, like a message that refused to fade. Around 3 a.m, I gave up trying to rest and sat at the small desk by the window. The city outside was still. The kind of quiet that felt like a held breath before something breaks. I opened the notebook again, spreading out the pages beneath the lamp. Every few bars, there were strange accents that didn't belong to any known tempo. Tiny pencil marks curved between notes, faint enough to be missed by anyone who wasn't looking for them. By sunrise, I had filled a page with numbers that might have been nonsense. Senshijou, Lianbai Joshisen, Tisha Liu, Dubai Yishar. I typed them into my phone. The map pulled up Baltimore, Maryland, a stretch of industrial blocks near the harbor, long since abandoned. I sat back in the chair. My pulse had that jittery hum it gets before a concert. Maybe I was losing it. Or maybe I had just found the first real lead in 60 years. By 8, I called Linda Morales. She picked up after 2 rings. Her voice, half asleep and half annoyed. Ethan, it's barely morning. Did you find the cure for cancer or something? Coordinates, I said. I think my grandfather left coordinates in the music. She went silent for a few seconds. Then she sighed. Send me a photo of what you found. I texted her the pages. 10 minutes later. My phone rang again. That's military grid notation. She said, you know how serious this is. Right. If that code still links to a classified site, you could be charged for espionage. I rubbed my face. I just want to know what my grandfather was hiding. Then let me help you. My voice used to have some weight in federal circles. I can check if that sector is still under any restrictions. But Ethan, if this leads to something real, you need to understand that every step after this will be dangerous. I looked at the notebook again. I already understood. Linda agreed to meet me at a diner near Capitol Hill later that morning. She was sharp in a dark suit, her gray hair tied back. Eyes tired but focused. She slid into the booth across from me and dropped a folder on the table. Inside were copies of old government memos, some heavily redacted. The header read, Operation Nightfall Logistics Division. This was buried deep, she said. But the Ashcroft name shows up in several subcontracts. Freight routing, supply chains, offshore accounts. The company still operates under Ashcroft Logistics, headquartered in Fort Worth. I said the name out loud. Richard's family. It sounded poisonous now. Linda stirred her coffee slowly. I knew his grandfather, she said. William Ashcroft. He testified before Congress in 1980. Denied everything. Then disappeared to Switzerland for 3 years. The scandal was sealed by national security privilege. My career ended after I tried to reopen it. I asked why she was helping me. Because your grandfather wasn't the thief they said he was. I read his deposition from 1966. He warned them this would happen. She pushed another paper toward me. It was a grainy photo of a warehouse labeled U.S. Army Storage Facility 447. Baltimore. Decommissioned in 1972. That's where your coordinates point, she said. The place technically doesn't exist anymore. I exhaled slowly. If it's empty, maybe that's the end of it. Or maybe, Linda said, it's where the truth got locked away. That afternoon, I took the train back to Chicago. The rhythm of the tracks felt like the heartbeat of the song, the same one that had carried me through sleepless nights as a kid. When I got home, I opened my grandfather's notebook again. In the margins beside the last staff line, he'd written one more word, almost invisible under smudged pencil. Echo. I didn't know if it was a name, a place, or something else, but it fit the way he thought. He used sound to talk in code. An echo repeats only what's true. I googled Camp Echo Baltimore, 1965. Nothing. Then Echo Military Depot, Maryland. One result buried deep in an archived forum. A user claimed their uncle had guarded a storage site called Echo Depot during the Vietnam years. The post was 10 years old. The account was deleted. By the next morning I couldn't sit still. I called Linda again. She answered on the first ring. If I go to Baltimore, will you come with me? That's not exactly a field trip kind of place, she said. I know. But if I'm right, that's where this ends. She hesitated, then sighed. I'll drive. We left at dawn the following day. Her silver sedan cutting through the rain along I-95. She drove like someone who'd done surveillance before. Eyes always moving. Mirrors checked twice. We stopped for coffee near Wilmington. She asked what I'd do if we actually found the gold. I don't care about the gold, I said. I just want proof my grandfather wasn't a traitor. That's what all good men say before money shows up, she replied. Not unkindly. By early afternoon, Baltimore's skyline appeared through the mist. The GPS led us to a stretch of warehouses near the Patapsco River. The sign on the gate was rusted, half torn away. The other half still read, Property of the United States Government. Linda parked a block away. We walked the rest of the distance under the steady drizzle. The air smelled of iron and salt. A chain-link fence surrounded the property, padlocked but brittle with age. Linda knelt, tugged at the latch, then pulled a small crowbar from her coat. The lock broke with a dry snap. Inside, the place looked forgotten. Empty pallets, rotted crates, broken lights. A dusty sign still hung from a beam. Storage Unit 447. The number hit like a jolt of electricity. We climbed a short staircase to an office overlooking the warehouse floor. Papers littered the desk. On the wall, a map of Southeast Asia with red pins marking Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam. I traced a finger along the coast. Linda pointed to a photograph tacked beside it. My grandfather again, younger, standing with two soldiers, their faces blacked out. She found a safe bolted to the floor under the desk. The dial was old, rusted. I remembered the number string from the composition. Maybe it wasn't just coordinates. Senshizhou, Arshizhou, San, Tishaleo, Liu, Shirar. I tried the sequence. The lock clicked. Inside were documents wrapped in plastic, a tarnished key, and a single line written on a torn envelope. Camp Echo Manifest. Linda stared at it. He left you the key. Before I could answer, a sound echoed through the building. Tires crunching gravel, a car door slamming, voices. I moved to the window. A black SUV had stopped by the gate. 3 men stepped out, all in suits. No markings. No hesitation, Linda whispered. They found us. I slipped the key into my pocket and killed the light. The men entered through the broken fence, flashlights cutting through the dust. One of them shouted, "Check upstairs." Linda grabbed my wrist, pulling me toward the back stairs. We slipped through the service exit just as a beam of light swept across the office window. Rain poured harder now, drumming on the metal roof. We didn't stop until we reached the car. As we drove away, Linda glanced at me. "Who do you think they were, Ashcroft?" I said, "Or someone who works for them." She nodded, hands tight on the wheel. "Whatever your grandfather found, they still want it buried." I leaned back, the key cold in my palm. For the first time, I believed the gold might actually exist. But what it represented scared me more than any amount of money ever could. The rain followed us halfway out of Baltimore before Linda finally eased off the gas. My pulse hadn't slowed since the warehouse. I kept checking the side mirror, half expecting headlights to appear behind us. They never did. But the silence in the car felt heavier than any pursuit. Linda kept her eyes on the road, jaw tight. "Whoever those men were," she said, "they weren't amateurs. They knew we'd be there." I stared at the key in my hand. It was small, brass, etched with numbers that looked like they'd been scratched in a hurry. Sibai Sishichi, Da-E. He wanted me to find it, I said quietly. "My grandfather. He wanted this to happen." Linda shook her head. "Maybe. Or maybe he wanted to warn you that some doors should stay closed." We drove through Delaware and into Pennsylvania before stopping at a roadside motel. The kind of place where nobody asked names, and the vending machine was half broken. I took the room next to hers. The key's weight in my pocket made it impossible to rest. I sat at the edge of the bed, listening to the hiss of cars on wet asphalt, and tried to piece together what I'd seen in that safe. The documents. The torn envelope marked Camp Echo Manifest. It sounded like a shipping log. Maybe an inventory. Maybe a confession. At midnight, I heard a knock. Linda stood in the doorway, holding 2 coffees. Her hair was loose, her eyes sharp. "We should talk before we decide what's next," she said. She sat across from me at the table, her tone low. "I called in a favor. A friend in D.C. still has access to Treasury's internal archives. Camp Echo was officially closed in 1970. But there's an off-record entry 2 years later, a transfer order marked confidential. Destination code BN 447. That's Baltimore National." I said, "Exactly." The transfer included 42 sealed crates. The remaining 30 weren't logged. My stomach tightened. "So 30 crates just disappeared?" She nodded. "And guess which company handled the logistics, Ashcroft?" Linda's voice softened. "Ethan. Whatever your grandfather did, he was in the middle of something massive. If those men today were Ashcrofts, it means they still have skin in the game. You can't do this alone." I stared at the coffee, cooling between my hands. Alone was how I'd done everything lately. The divorce, the silence, the apartment. But she was right. "What's our next step?" I asked. "We find the vault," she said. "That key isn't decorative. If BN 447 is what I think it is, there's still a deposit box under your grandfather's name." I looked at her. half amazed, half terrified. You really believe that? She smiled faintly. I stopped believing in coincidences a long time ago. We drove into Baltimore again the next morning under a pale sky. The air smelled of salt and exhaust. Baltimore National Bank was a marble relic on East Lombard Street, the kind of building that had seen generations of secrets pass quietly through its vaults. Inside, the floor was polished to a mirror shine, and the tellers looked like they'd been trained to spot trouble. Linda flashed her credentials, introduced herself as legal counsel for the Brennan estate, and asked for access to any historical safety deposit boxes registered under Eugene Brennan. The clerk disappeared into a back room. I waited, heart pounding, while the marble clock above the counter ticked louder with each second. After what felt like forever, the clerk returned with a manager, gray suit, kind eyes that didn't quite reach the edges. Mr. Brennan, he said. This might take some time. The record is old. We don't usually hold files this far back. I tried to keep my tone steady. I understand. I just need confirmation. He nodded and vanished again. Linda leaned close, whispering, if he calls security, we leave immediately. But he didn't. 10 minutes later he came back, holding a small envelope. Mr. Brennan, it appears your grandfather did maintain a deposit here, though it's listed under a restricted federal account. Access requires dual authorization. Dual. He gestured to the envelope. Inside was a form stamped with the U.S. Treasury seal and a field labeled Secondary Custodian Colonel James Whitman. Linda exhaled. He knew. I stared at the paper, disbelief twisting into anger. The colonel hadn't told me everything. The manager handed over a copy for reference. I'm afraid I can't open the box without both parties present, he said. It's protocol. Linda thanked him and guided me out before I could say something reckless. Outside, she said quietly. We need to find Whitman again. And we need to be smart about it. I nodded, still gripping the envelope. That night, back in the motel, I called my mother. She sounded weaker than I remembered. Ethan. Honey. Is everything all right? Yeah. Mom. I just have some things to figure out. Do you remember anything about Grandpa's time in the service? A pause. He never talked about it much. But when your father died, he sent me a letter. Said some debts take a lifetime to clear. Why no reason? I lied. Just trying to understand him better. Before she hung up, she said, your grandfather used to say, gold only shines if it's clean. Whatever that means. I sat in the dark long after she'd gone silent. Outside, thunder rolled in from the east. I kept hearing her voice. The way it cracked around that sentence. Gold only shines if it's clean. Maybe that was the point of all of this. Maybe Eugene hadn't stolen anything. Maybe he'd buried it to keep it from being dirtied. I opened my grandfather's notebook again. The next page had new notations. Smaller. Packed tight between the staves. I traced them carefully, whispering the rhythm. Si dao si. Si dao chi. E. Then the word echo again. Faint, but deliberate. I realized the numbers matched the key. Si bai si shi chi dao yi. Linda knocked on the adjoining wall between our rooms. You still awake? She called through the thin plaster. Yeah. Then come over. I just got an email. She was sitting at the small desk with her laptop open. The message glowed on the screen. Unsigned. It contained one sentence and a photo. The sentence read, you're digging in the wrong place. The photo was of my Chicago apartment door. Taken that morning. My throat went dry. They're in Chicago. Linda's face hardened. Then we're out of time. Tomorrow we go back to Whitman. With or without an appointment. I nodded, staring at the photo until my vision blurred. Whoever they were, they wanted this over. But so did I. Outside, the rain started again. Soft at first. Then harder. A steady percussion against the window. I placed the key on the table beside the laptop, its brass surface catching a glint of lightning. For a moment it looked alive, like it was waiting for its turn to unlock something more than just a vault. Morning came with a flat gray sky and the smell of wet pavement. Linda was already in the lot when I stepped out, coffee in hand, hair pulled back like she was reporting for duty. She said we head to Treasury and keep it simple. We ask for Whitman. We demand an explanation. We keep the key out of sight. I nodded and told her about the line in my grandfather's notebook that matched the numbers on the key. She absorbed it in silence and then said one step at a time. Traffic into the city crawled. I watched the mirrors while Linda threaded us through lanes with the calm of someone used to being followed. The same black SUV I had clocked near the warehouse slid into view and kept its distance. I felt the old knot tighten under my ribs. Linda said, "Do not stare at them. Let them think we have not noticed." At Treasury, the guards scanned our IDs and told us Colonel Whitman was in a closed session. The receptionist offered to take a message. Linda said, with a steady smile, that we would wait. After 20 minutes, a man in a dark suit approached and said my name like a question. "Agent Marcus Harris," he said. "Federal Bureau of Investigation. Strategic Assets Unit. We should talk." He led us to a small conference room that smelled like coffee and paper. He sat with his hands folded and gave me a professional frown. He said, "You were at a decommissioned federal storage site in Baltimore yesterday. There was a break-in. You understand why that concerns me?" Linda answered before I could. She said my client accessed a site tied to a long-closed matter connected to a Treasury claim. He did not remove anything. He contacted counsel and intends to cooperate. Harris looked from her to me and said, "Do you have anything from that site?" Linda said my client will not answer that without a formal request. He drummed his fingers once and then asked about the key in general terms. I kept my eyes on the table and said, "I want to verify my grandfather's claim and clear his name. That is it." Harris studied me for a long moment. The way a surgeon studies a chart before a risky cut. Then he said, "If Ashcroft Logistics is poking around the same places you are, you need to be careful. Those people do not back down." He slid a card across the table and said, "Call me before you do anything else." Outside, the same SUV rolled past the curb like a slow tide and kept going. Linda exhaled through her nose and said they wanted us to see them. I said they know where I live. 2. She reminded me of the photo of my apartment door. The skin on the back of my neck prickled. We sat in the car and weighed our next move. Going straight back to the bank without Whitman felt like walking into a trap. Waiting felt worse. Linda said we bring sunlight. We hand the breadcrumbs to someone who can make noise faster than Ashcroft can bury it. I asked who. She said Daniel Price at the Chicago Tribune. She had clashed with him on cases years ago and trusted his instincts. I told her I could be on a call in 10 minutes. Daniel answered on the second ring. His voice carried that restless reporter energy. Bright even through static. He asked what we had and I told him the short version. A classified operation. A defense contractor with a family name that had crawled into my marriage. Coordinates hidden in music. A key that matched a vault number. He asked if there was proof beyond the family story. Linda took the phone and laid out what we had pulled from the warehouse and Treasury. Careful with the parts that could get us arrested. Daniel said if half of that holds. This is a once-in-a-decade story. He could meet us in D.C. by evening or start digging from Chicago. Linda told him to start with Ashcroft's old shipping records and the congressional transcripts from the 80s. She also asked him to look into any movement of sealed containers from Maryland facilities around 70 to 72. Daniel said, "Give me 6 hours," and hung up. We drove to a diner near Union Station and picked a corner booth with a view of the lot. I tried to eat, but the eggs cooled untouched. Linda kept working the phones. She called an old colleague in the Attorney General's office and left a precise message about a vault subject to dual authorization and a potential conflict involving a current Treasury official. She called a judge's clerk she knew in Baltimore to ask about obtaining a preservation order for records from the decommissioned site. Then she told me to call my friend Mick. Mick Torres used to work in a Chicago precinct before he decided he preferred following people to filing reports. He picked up with a familiar rasp and said he had missed my voice and what was broken now. I told him I needed a plate run and a quiet check on a corporate shell. Black SUV. DC plates. Partial number. 3 men with the haircut you can set your watch to. Also, a company called Ashcroft Logistics out of Fort Worth with a handful of holding entities. He whistled softly and said, "Give me an hour." He asked if I was safe. I lied and said yes. He said that never used to be your best skill. An hour later, Daniel texted first. He wrote that he had found a trail. In June '65, Ashcroft Logistics won a rush contract to move medical supplies and avionics parts from a Maryland depot classified as Echo. The manifests were sealed. In 72, there was a sanitized transfer of 42 sealed crates from a defunct facility to a bank in Baltimore, using a federal code that matched the partial we had. The managing officer's signatures were redacted. He sent a screenshot. The date matched the annotation Linda had found in the archives. My hands started to shake under the table. I was not sure if it was relief or something colder. Mick called 5 minutes later. He said the SUV plates belonged to a rental paid by an Ashcroft subsidiary that did executive protection. He said the driver had 2 sealed arrests in Texas and a current unlicensed security complaint in Virginia. He also said I should get my place swept for a tracker and cameras before I went home again. I told him about the photo of my door. He went quiet and then said, "I will send a guy I trust to sit on your block tonight." Linda listened to all of it and then said we had enough to push harder. She wanted to schedule a formal meeting with Whitman through counsel and force the question of dual authorization for the vault. She also wanted Daniel to request emergency preservation of relevant records and to prepare a first-look story that did not tip our exact locations. She said once it is public, they have fewer places to hide. She was calm, focused, and unmovable. I realized she was the only reason I was not drowning. By late afternoon, we pointed the car toward the motel to regroup before calling Whitman's office again. The sky had the bruised color of a storm that could not decide if it was coming or going. Linda pulled up to a light. The street was slick and empty. I saw the SUV 2 cars back. I opened my mouth to say something. The impact came from the left, like a fist from nowhere. Our car spun, and the world smeared into metal and glass. The air filled with the dry pop of deployed airbags and the chemical burn of propellant. When the car stopped, we were half up on the curb. My ears rang. Linda swore once, crisp and controlled, then checked her hands, her ribs, her eyes. I did the same. We were banged up but moving. A second car screamed away down the cross street. A dark sedan with no plates. The black SUV rolled by, slow as if to count, then accelerated and vanished. I stepped out into the raw air and steadied myself on the crumpled door. People had started to gather. Someone yelled that they were calling 911. Linda told me to check the windshield. Tucked under the wiper was a small folded note held with a strip of tape. I peeled it off with shaking fingers. The paper was plain and damp. 4 words in block letters. "It is not yours." I handed it to Linda. She read it and then looked past me at the direction the cars had gone. Her face had gone very still. She said we file a report. We call Harris. And we move now before anyone decides to finish what they started. A police cruiser slid to the curb and an officer jogged over. Voice calm and efficient. Linda handled the talking while I watched the street. I could feel fear trying to take the wheel in my chest, and I kept forcing it back into the passenger seat. The tow truck hooked the car. The officer offered to arrange a ride. Linda said we would manage. We walked to a pharmacy a block away and bought cold packs and bottled water. I sat on a plastic chair near the photo kiosk and pressed ice against my shoulder. Linda stood by the front window. Phone to her ear. She was talking to Whitman's assistant. Voice clipped. Precis. And entirely without apology. She asked for a meeting in the morning. Counsel present. To address a dual authorization vault tied to a deceased federal operative. She added that if the meeting did not happen, a story would. She hung up and turned to me. They will see us at 9. She said. Bring the notebook. Do not bring the key out until we are in a room with a camera and a witness. I nodded. The note sat in my pocket. The letters pressing into my skin like a branded warning. Somewhere between fear and adrenaline, I felt another sensation rise. Something I had not felt since the last time I walked on stage in front of 2,000 people and decided to play the cadenza a little faster than anyone expected. It felt like resolve. We stepped back into the evening. The city buzzed. Indifferent. Above us, the clouds broke just enough to let a thin band of light cut across the street, like a metronome line. Linda said, "Let's move," and I followed. The key warm again in my palm. As if it had decided what song it wanted to open. By morning, the bruise on my shoulder had darkened to the color of old wine. Linda looked worse. A thin cut along her hairline and circles under her eyes. She refused to go to the hospital. Just cleaned the wound in the motel sink and said we needed to stay on schedule. I watched her bandage it with surgical precision and realized this was what she did best. Keep moving forward while the rest of us were still trying to breathe. We left before sunrise and drove to the Treasury complex. Pulling into the lot at 8:40, the air felt colder than it should have. Security took our names, checked our IDs twice, and escorted us to a waiting area that looked more like a courtroom than an office. Cameras in the corners tracked every move. At 9 sharp, the door opened, and Colonel Whitman walked in. Uniform crisp, eyes unreadable. Behind him was Agent Harris. The same look of suspicion from before, but tempered now with something else. Maybe caution. Whitman nodded at the chairs across from him. Please. Sit. His voice was calm, but carried the weight of authority that doesn't invite small talk. Linda set her briefcase on the table and started before he could. Colonel. Last night my client was attacked. His car was rammed. His property photographed. And his movements tracked by a security team connected to Ashcroft Logistics. We believe this connects to the dual authorization vault your office controls. We want full disclosure. Whitman's eyes flicked to me. You were in Baltimore again, I shook my head. Not since we met. But someone else was. He reached into a folder, took out the photo of my apartment door. The same one we'd received by email. I felt my stomach tighten. Where did you get that FBI intercept? Said Harris. Your communication was flagged after yesterday's meeting. We traced the message through an encrypted relay owned by an Ashcroft subsidiary. They're watching both of you. Linda folded her hands. Then, maybe you can explain why your name is on the access form for the Baltimore National Vault. Whitman didn't blink. Because I'm the only living official authorized under that file. Eugene Brennan's mission was classified beyond top secret. When it was declassified, the assets reverted to the Treasury under my division's custody. You mean the gold? I said. He exhaled through his nose. Yes. The gold. The crates exist. 72 in total. 42 were recovered in the 70s. Repatriated to Fort Knox under diplomatic cover. 30 remain unaccounted for. I leaned forward. My grandfather didn't steal them. Did he? Whitman studied me for a long time. No. He didn't. He hid them. From the same men who are now following you. The words landed like a punch. Linda whispered. To protect them from Ashcroft. Whitman nodded. Operation Nightfall was supposed to secure the transfer of captured gold from Southeast Asia. Ashcroft Logistics falsified manifests and redirected shipments to offshore accounts. Your grandfather discovered the scheme. He refused to cooperate and vanished with the final convoy. The army labeled him rogue to protect the operation. I felt the room tilt. Everything I had grown up believing about the quiet man who played piano in nursing homes fell apart. Whitman continued. We've known fragments of this story for decades. But the records were sealed under national security restrictions. Only after declassification did we find his final deposition, encrypted in music notation. It pointed to that same vault. The key in your possession is the last piece. Harris placed a small recorder on the table. You have the key. Mr. Brennan. Linda's hand brushed mine under the table. Not until we know what's inside. Whitman looked almost weary now. That vault contains evidence of war profiteering and a complete ledger of Ashcroft's transfers. If it goes public, it will destroy one of the largest defense contractors in the country. So that's why they're chasing me. I said. Harris nodded. They think you can expose them. Linda stood, her voice steady. Then we open the vault today. With both authorizations. And put an end to this. Whitman hesitated. Then rose. Follow me. We moved through another series of corridors and down 2 levels into the sub-basement. The elevator opened onto a narrow hall lined with reinforced steel doors. The air smelled of metal and disinfectant. At the end was a security checkpoint guarded by 2 armed officers. Whitman presented his ID, and they waved us through. The vault itself looked almost ordinary. A brushed steel door with a keypad and fingerprint reader. He entered his credentials. Then turned to me. Insert the key when the green light appears. I waited. The click came like a breath between movements. I turned the key. The lock released with a low groan. Inside was a small chamber. Temperature controlled. Walls lined with numbered boxes. Whitman opened one labeled 447-1. Inside were microfilm reels, a few envelopes, and a metal canister the size of a lunchbox. He set it on the table in the center. That he said quietly. Is your grandfather's field recording? Harris opened the canister carefully and slid out a reel-to-reel tape. The label read Nightfall, February 1965. There was another smaller envelope taped to it. My grandfather's handwriting across the front. I recognized the looping E immediately. For the one who still listens. I couldn't breathe. Whitman placed the reel on an old player, connected cables, and pressed start. The hiss of static filled the room, followed by my grandfather's voice, thin but steady. If you are hearing this, I failed to return the gold. Not because I took it, but because I couldn't let men like Ashcroft use it. They killed Captain Reyes and Sergeant Dyer. They'll kill again to hide it. The rest is buried where silence hums loudest. Echo bass. The recording clicked off. Linda whispered. Echo bass. The warehouse. Whitman nodded. The crates he hid were never moved. Harris looked at him sharply. Then why wasn't this acted on years ago? Because the people running Ashcroft were the same ones funding the investigation, Whitman said. My division couldn't touch them without political cover. Now, with this, we finally have it. I leaned against the wall, dizzy. My grandfather's voice had sounded so calm, even knowing what was coming. He must have known he would die carrying that lie. Whitman turned to me. We'll need a signed release from you to recover the contents. Once they're confirmed, you'll be the rightful heir to his compensation. I laughed softly. I don't care about the money. I just want his name cleared. Whitman's expression softened for the first time. Then help us finish what he started. As we left the vault, Linda touched my arm. There's more on that tape. You heard the way it cut off. He mentioned echo bass twice. We should go back. I nodded, though the idea of stepping into that place again made my skin crawl. Outside, Harris handed me his card again. I'll have an agent posted near your apartment in Chicago. Do not travel alone. We stepped out into the cold sunlight. Traffic roared beyond the gates. Linda lit a cigarette she hadn't admitted to carrying. She looked at me through the smoke. You realize what happens if this gets out, yeah? Ashcroft burns. And so do a lot of careers in Washington. She said. I thought of my mother in her small house. The piano my grandfather had left her. The same one I'd learned on. The last thing she needed was another scandal with our name on it. Linda seemed to read my mind. Ethan. If you walk away now, they win again. I looked at the horizon. Gray against the city skyline. Somewhere under that same sky, 30 crates of gold sat in the dark, waiting for someone to finish a story that had started before I was born. The drive back to Baltimore felt longer than the first time. The air was colder, the light thinner, and the silence between Linda and me heavier, with everything we now knew. I stared out the window, watching the highway cut through bare trees and gray farmland. The tape of my grandfather's voice kept replaying in my head. Every word etched in the rhythm of my thoughts. Echo bass, buried where silence hums loudest. Linda broke the silence first. You realize what he meant, don't you? Silence that hums. That's not poetry. It's location. I turned to her. You think it's sound-related? She nodded. Acoustics. Echoes. Maybe he buried it near something that vibrates or makes constant noise. Substation. Power grid. Maybe even a train yard. Something that hides the sound of machinery. I leaned forward, opening the notebook again. On the last page, under the faint pencil marks, there were a few musical notations I hadn't noticed before. A repeating low-frequency pattern. It almost looked like a hum. Linda glanced at it while driving. That's not a melody. It's a wavelength. A wavelength of what she smiled faintly. You're the musician. The question stayed with me all the way into the city. By the time we reached the outer industrial district, I'd already pulled up a map of Baltimore's old power substations. One was located less than 2 miles from the old warehouse where we found the key. Linda parked a block away. We moved through the alleys on foot, keeping close to the brick walls. The substation sat behind a fence topped with barbed wire, humming faintly in the afternoon air. The vibration was low, steady, the kind of sound that sinks into your bones. I held up the notebook. The pattern on the page matched the hum. That's it, I whispered. That's what he meant. We walked the perimeter until we found an old concrete service tunnel, half hidden behind dead ivy. The sign said, restricted access. faded almost to nothing. Linda crouched, testing the lock. It was old, rusted. She used a pry tool from her bag, and the latch snapped after a minute. The door creaked open. Inside, the air was damp and metallic. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, beams catching dust and rusted pipes. Water dripped somewhere in the distance, steady as a metronome. The hum grew louder the deeper we went, vibrating through the walls. We reached a junction where the tunnel split. The left path sloped downward. The right led toward the substation foundations. Linda pointed left. Buried. That's what he said. We followed the decline until the ground leveled out into a wide chamber lined with concrete pillars. Someone had been there before us. Boot prints in the dust. Fresh. My pulse quickened. Linda whispered. Stay close. There was movement ahead. Faint light flickering off metal. Voices. 2 men. Maybe 3. We killed our flashlights and crept forward. Through the gloom I could see them kneeling near a patch of disturbed earth. A portable floodlight cast sharp shadows against the walls. One man was speaking into a radio. Couldn't make out the words, but I caught the name Ashcroft. Linda mouthed. They're digging. I felt something shift inside me. Anger. Sharp and cold. All this time, my grandfather had kept this hidden to protect people like them from profiting off blood money. And now they were about to take it again. We backed up quietly. But one of the men turned suddenly. Flashlight sweeping across the tunnel. It caught the glint of Linda's belt buckle. Voices shouted. Footsteps pounded. Run, she said. We sprinted down the tunnel. Flashlights bouncing. Air echoing with shouts behind us. The path twisted and narrowed until we burst through a side exit into the substation yard. I slammed the metal gate shut and jammed the latch. The men's lights flickered behind it. Muffled curses echoing. Linda bent over, breathing hard. They found the crates, she said between breaths. We need to call Harris now. I pulled out my phone. No signal underground. But outside the bars flickered back. I hit his number. He answered on the first ring. They're in the tunnels, I said. Ashcroft's men. They're digging. Where old substation off Orleans Street, I said. We need backup. Stay out of there, he ordered. I'm sending a tactical unit. Do not engage. Linda grabbed my arm. They'll move the gold before he even gets here. We watched as a van rolled up near the gate. Same logo we'd seen before. A fake construction company front. 2 more men jumped out, carrying equipment. We're too late, I said. Linda's jaw tightened. Not if we slow them down. She crossed the street, yanking open the side door of a parked utility truck. She cut the ignition wires with a penknife and twisted them together. The engine roared to life. Get in, she said. You're insane, and you're welcome. We crashed through the outer fence, metal screaming as we tore it aside. The van jerked to a halt. Men shouting. Linda spun the wheel, blocking the tunnel entrance. I jumped out, grabbed a loose chain from the back, and looped it through the gate handle. They pounded on the metal from the other side. But it held. Sirens wailed in the distance. Harris had made good on his word. Linda looked at me, breathing hard. You good, not really, I said. But I'll take it. The first patrol cars arrived minutes later. Lights washing the street in red and blue. Harris stepped out of the lead vehicle, body armor under his coat, face carved from stone. He took one look at the scene and muttered something under his breath. You two have a real problem following instructions, he said. Linda crossed her arms. You're welcome for saving your evidence. He looked past her at the gate. Inside, the men were being cuffed by tactical officers. One of them shouted that they had a right to be there, that Ashcroft Logistics was under government contract. Harris didn't even blink. He turned to me. Your grandfather's work just cracked open a 50-year cover-up. You realize what that means, I nodded. It means they'll come harder. He pocketed the key I handed him. Not if we get ahead of it. We'll secure everything from the site and transfer it under federal custody. But you, Mr. Brennan, need to disappear for a while. Linda stiffened. He's not a witness. He's a victim. Harris shook his head. He's both. The agents began loading the recovered crates onto trucks. Even through the noise, I could hear the faint hum from the substation. It mixed with the sound of engines. Sirens and voices until it all blended into one note. Steady and low. Linda leaned against the truck, wiping dust from her hands. You think this is over? No, I said. It's just starting. She nodded, eyes distant. Then we'd better make sure your grandfather's truth doesn't die in a vault again. I watched the last crate being sealed and lifted away. The hum faded, leaving only silence. For the first time in days, I wasn't sure if that silence meant peace or warning. The news broke before sunrise. By the time I made it back to the motel, the story was already running on every channel. A voiceover cut between grainy footage of the substation and aerial shots of federal trucks loading sealed crates. The headline read, "Federal Agents Uncover Decades Old Defense Scandal." Beneath it, in smaller print, "Ashcroft Logistics Under Investigation." I sat on the edge of the bed, half stunned, half hollow. My grandfather's name wasn't mentioned yet, but I knew it was only a matter of time. Linda came in with 2 coffees and tossed one onto the table. They're spinning it as a government operation, she said. No names. No heroes. Just another mysterious recovery effort. That's how they'll bury it again, I said. She nodded. Unless we make noise first. The phone on the nightstand buzzed. It was Daniel Price from the Tribune. He sounded wired, like a man chasing lightning. He said the FBI press release had been vague, but his sources confirmed that evidence tied to Ashcroft's offshore accounts was found at the site. He asked if I was ready to go on record. Not yet, I said. There's still more out there. He hesitated. Ethan, the longer you wait, the more they'll control the story. I looked at Linda. She shook her head slightly. Tell him soon, she whispered. Not yet. I told Daniel I'd call him back and hung up. The silence afterward felt sharp. Linda paced the room. They'll use national security to redact everything. Harris will fight to keep it sealed until the case is cold. You saw how nervous Whitman looked yesterday. He knows how deep this goes. I rubbed my face, the exhaustion crawling under my skin. So what do? We make it public. Not the gold. Not the operation. But the ledger. The documents you found in your grandfather's things. Those are enough to prove Ashcroft's fraud without crossing classified lines. I thought of the leather folder still hidden in my violin case back in Chicago. The one I'd barely touched since this started. It had seemed like just another relic. But now it felt like the last bullet in a long, quiet war. Linda saw the look on my face. You kept it, didn't you? I nodded. He gave it to me for a reason. Then we use it. That afternoon, we met Harris at a federal safe house just outside D.C. He looked more tired than before. Sleeves rolled up, tie loosened. He said the men we caught in the tunnels were cooperating. Or pretending to. All ex-security contractors tied to Ashcroft Logistics. Their orders came through encrypted servers routed overseas. They were after the crates. I said. Not just the crates, he replied. They wanted the documents your grandfather left inside them. Turns out one crate was lined with lead. Inside were reels of microfilm that detail Ashcroft's transactions from 1964 to 1972. It's damning evidence. But it's still under review. Linda leaned forward. Meaning the Bureau will sit on it until the lawyers choke it to death. Harris didn't argue. Off the record, he said. There are people upstairs who would rather this story never see daylight. But on the record, we're doing our job. I stared at him. My grandfather died branded a thief. My father lived with that shame. You really think I'm going to let them bury this again? He looked at me for a long moment. Then sighed. There's a press conference tomorrow. Whitman's handling it. If you show up, it'll force their hand. But if you do, you'll be a target. I glanced at Linda. She was already shaking her head. He's right, she said. They'll paint you as unstable. Some desperate musician chasing ghosts. I don't care. That's the problem, she said quietly. You do. The next morning, we arrived at the Treasury building under heavy security. Reporters clustered outside the barricades. Microphones like bayonets. Inside, Whitman stood behind a podium, flanked by Harris and a line of officials. His statement was careful, almost sterile. He confirmed the recovery of stolen federal property linked to a 1,970 seconds defense contract, praised the cooperation between agencies, and refused to answer questions about ongoing investigations. Not once did he mention the name Brennan. My hands tightened around the notebook I carried. Linda whispered, "Don't. Not yet." But my legs were already moving. I stepped past the security line and spoke loud enough to carry. My grandfather wasn't a thief. He was a soldier who stopped men like Ashcroft from selling American blood for profit. If you're going to tell the story, tell the truth. The cameras swung toward me. Reporters shouted questions. Whitman's expression didn't change, but I saw it in his eyes. A flicker of recognition. Maybe even respect. Harris looked like he wanted to drag me out himself, but he didn't move. Security escorted me from the building, and by the time I reached the street, phones were already buzzing with alerts. My name was out. We spent the rest of the day in hiding at a motel in Arlington. Linda watched the news while I sat by the window, phone in hand, waiting for the fallout. It came sooner than expected. Daniel called again. His voice trembled with adrenaline. "Ethan, the story's spreading. Ashcroft stock just tanked. And get this. A whistleblower from inside the company contacted me after your outburst. He says he has files that prove Ashcroft's board laundered profits through defense shell contracts as recently as 2018. He wants to meet. Where Union Station? Tonight. He's scared. Says he's being followed." Linda was already packing her bag before I hung up. She moved fast, but I could see the unease in her face. "You trust him?" "I trust that he wants to live," I said. "That's usually enough." We left at dusk, taking back streets and changing cars twice, just in case. The air was cold and sharp when we reached the station. The crowd was thick, travelers hurrying under fluorescent lights. We waited near the old ticket booths, watching everyone who passed. Then I saw him, mid-30s, glasses, carrying a worn briefcase. He scanned the crowd until his eyes locked on mine. He looked terrified. He started toward us. But before he could reach us, a sound cracked through the noise. A single shot. The crowd screamed. He collapsed a few feet away, the briefcase sliding from his hand. Blood pooled across the white tile. Linda dragged me down behind a bench. Security alarms blared. People running in every direction. I looked up just long enough to see a man in a dark coat vanish into the crowd. Linda grabbed the briefcase and pulled me toward the exit. We ran through the parking lot, breath burning in our chests. Sirens wailed behind us. She threw the case into the back seat and floored the car. When we were clear, she looked at me, face pale under the streetlights. "You still think this is about money?" I stared at the blood on my hands, then at the briefcase between us. "No. It's about what's inside." Linda nodded grimly. "Then we find out before they do." The briefcase rattled as we hit the highway, the metal clasps glinting in the headlights. I didn't open it yet. I just kept my hand on it, feeling its weight, knowing it was the same kind of weight my grandfather must have carried all those years ago. Linda drove us to a lit parking lot behind a strip mall 2 exits from the station. The briefcase sat on my knees like a live thing. We took a second to scan for tails, then slipped into a small accountant's office. Linda rented, sometimes for messy depositions. She locked the door and pulled the blinds. The fluorescent hum sounded too loud in the quiet. She set the case on the desk and nodded. "Do it." The clasps fought me, then snapped. Inside were 2 hardbound ledgers, a stack of envelopes sealed with old wax, and a small metal tin rattling with something inside. The first ledger cracked at the spine and stank of paper and ink that had waited too long to be believed. Names filled the columns, dates and dollar amounts that started in 1964 and ran clean through 1972. Next to some entries were 3 letters in block print. ECH. My finger paused there. "Echo," I said. Linda flipped pages with quick, careful motions. "Here. Board minutes. Off-site. A vote to reclassify seized inventory as medical equipment. Shipments rerouted to private storage." She pulled out an envelope and tilted the seal toward the light. Inside was a faded photo of 3 men at a long table. The middle one was William Ashcroft, The others wore the kind of smiles people put on when they think the world belongs to them. The tin held a flash drive and a folded note. No signature. The scrawl said the accountant's no. This is the modern trail. We plugged the drive into Linda's laptop, and a directory opened with clean spreadsheets labeled by quarter. The dates were recent. 2015 through 2018. Shell subsidiaries. Consulting fees. Secure transfers to a bank in Zurich that had changed names 3 times and never changed its rules. Linda breathed out. Shaky for the first time since I had met her. This is not just history. This is the same scam with better software. I called Daniel. He answered before the first ring finished and listened without breathing. He said, "Bring me scans now." I said no. We meet in a hotel room with the curtains open. 2 cameras rolling. And 3 copies leave the room with 3 different people. He said done and sent an address. I called Harris next. He sounded like exhaustion pinned to a desk. When I told him we had ledgers and a modern digital trail, the dead air on the line felt like another door opening. He said do not move alone and then said he was already on his way. The meeting went the way Linda designed it. Lights on. Phones in the bathroom. She scanned every page and burned 3 discs. Daniel took one and left through the lobby with a bodyguard he paid in cash. Harris watched the entire process and signed a chain of custody for 1 set. Linda kept the 3rd and put it into a fire safe that looked older than the building. I kept my hands still. I did not trust them to stop shaking if I started. By morning, the arrests had begun in Fort Worth. The first alert hit my phone as a low vibration at 5:30. Federal agents executed warrants at Ashcroft Logistics headquarters. By 6:15, there were photos of Richard being led to a car. Face like marble. Jaw set in a look that tried to say dignity and ended at fury. The anchor read obstruction of justice. Conspiracy to defraud the United States. Wire fraud. And tax evasion. The man in the dark coat from Union Station did not make the news. Harris told us quietly that he had a name and had been picked up outside a motel near College Park. The briefcase had done more than carry paper. It had carried a man's last line of defense. It had kept his truth alive long enough to matter. Treasury scheduled a midday briefing. Linda and I stood in the back of the room while Whitman walked to the podium. His voice was steady, almost softer than usual. He confirmed that a portion of the recovered property had been tied to a classified operation in the 1960s, and that new evidence connected historical theft to modern crimes. Then he did something I did not expect. He said Eugene Brennan acted to protect federal assets at risk of diversion, and that the department formally recognized his role in preserving them for recovery. He did not call my grandfather a hero. He did something cleaner. He told the truth. I felt the air leave my chest, and did not try to bring it back for a few seconds. Afterward, a woman from Public Affairs led us down to a secure inspection room. 3 crates sat on low rolling tables under bright lights. Each one was stenciled with numbers and letters that made my throat burn. EB 1965. A technician pried a lid with a bar and the smell of old wood and oil rose like a memory. Inside, the bars lay in 2 precise stacks. Dull under dust and time. Stamped with weight and mint marks. The tech lifted one and misted it for a chemical reading. Then wiped the top surface with a soft cloth until the stamp shone. He handed me a second cloth and waited. I wiped the next bar. Careful. Steady. As if tuning a string. The gold warmed under my hand. My phone buzzed. Vera. Her message asked if we could talk. She said she was scared and alone and that she made a mistake. I watched the gold reflect the lights in the ceiling and the shape of my own face. I texted back that I was too busy polishing. Then I put the phone in my pocket and handed the cloth to the technician. By that night, Daniel's story ran with everything we had allowed. He wrote about a soldier who hid gold to stop thieves. About ledgers that survived vaults and decades. About a system that finally ran out of places to hide. He did not show my face. He did not need to. The comments filled with veterans thanking a man they had never met, and families who had lost people to wars they still felt in their bones. My mother would have liked that part. She always said music mattered most when it held someone else up. Months passed as the cases moved through courts and hearings. Richard took a plea on the financial charges and the obstruction and stared down the cameras like a man who had never learned how to apologize. The shooter at Union Station pleaded guilty to manslaughter and gave up the chain of orders that pointed back to a private security arm with contracts in 3 states. Whitman kept his job and kept his distance. Harris sent a short note after the verdicts that said your grandfather would have been proud, and then never called again. The money conversation began whether I wanted it to or not. There were compensation formulas and recovery values and legal guides who spoke in careful sentences about what was mine. In the end, I asked for something simple. One crate to be cataloged and sealed under the name Brennan Veterans Music Foundation, with the value reserved for scholarships, therapy programs, and the kind of small grants that keep a family upright when the ground goes out from under them. Treasury agreed. Lawyers wrote more words than anyone will ever read. The crate was tagged with a code and moved to a vault in Illinois I will never see. I kept one bar on long-term loan for public display. It sits behind glass now with a small plaque that says it belonged to a man who chose silence until someone else could play the truth. The night of the concert did not feel like a victory lap. It felt like a vigil that someone finally allowed to end. Chicago Symphony Hall glowed the way it does in winter. Warm wood and gold leaf, and the quiet buzz of an audience that arrives early and leaves late. I wore a simple black suit and the kind of calm you only get after there is nothing left to prove. Linda sat in the second row, Daniel next to her, still scribbling notes because habits are heavier than deadlines. In the box above them, I recognized Whitman by the set of his shoulders, and Harris by the way he scanned the room twice before sitting. On the front row, there was an empty seat with a small frame resting on it. My mother's photo in black and white. She had that half smile she saved for Sunday mornings and birthdays. I walked out to the center and let the room settle. The first notes of Redemption Suite are written to sound like a voice clearing a path. The melody carries the old code inside it. All the pauses where a number hides. All the rests where a man might think about lying and decide to live with the cost of telling the truth instead. The hall breathed with me. The wood vibrated under my feet. Somewhere in the middle movement, I felt the old ache loosen in my chest. I played through it. You always play through it. When the last note hung and faded, the room stood as one body and kept standing. I did not bow for long. It felt wrong to take too much of that for myself. The applause fell into the kind of quiet that does not belong to anyone. I looked up at the balcony, and the light caught the frame on the seat beside mine. For a second, it looked like the photograph had moved, like she had leaned closer to hear me better. Maybe that is what music does when it is honest. It makes the past lean in for a second and then lets it rest. After the concert, I walked home the long way. Lake Michigan held a stubborn line of light along the horizon. My phone buzzed with messages I would answer tomorrow. I unlocked my door and set the violin on the table. The apartment did not feel small anymore. It felt like a place that understood the weight it had held and qualified for something better. If you made it this far, tell me what part stayed with you. Tell me if you have ever carried a secret long enough to feel its shape change in your hands. If you want more stories where justice takes the long road and still finds the door, tap, follow, and leave a comment, so I know which truth to play next.